Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, immersive journeys into the quiet corners of history, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. And while you're listening, feel free to let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from? Now, take a breath, and let's begin tonight's long, slow story. Asterisk, she was not yet a mother, not yet even a queen. She was a girl named Olympias, born into the royal family of Epirus, descended, so they claimed, from the mythical Achilles. Her hair was dark, her gaze unflinching. Before history knew her name, she walked barefoot into temples, pressing her fingers into cracked stone altars and whispering questions that echoed through the hollows of old gods. In those days, gods still lived in smoke, in symbols, and Olympias believed they spoke to her. It was sometime around 358 BCE when she married King Philip II of Macedon. It was not a love match. He was brash, war-hardened, nearly 20 years her senior, and already weathered by political scars. But he had ambition, and she had a lineage that traced itself backward into legend. Their union was forged not in affection, but in strategy. Macedon needed Epirus, and Epirus needed Macedon to hold back the tribal borders that threatened both. Soon after their marriage, Olympias withdrew from court life. Some said she avoided the drunken parties and wild pageants Philip adored. Others said she was devoted to her gods, particularly the cult of Dionysus, which fascinated her with its secretive rites and visions. But then, one night, the story says she dreamed of something strange. In the dream, her womb was struck by lightning. It did not hurt. Instead, it glowed. A warm, white fire filled her body. Then, a thunderous voice, some say it was Zeus himself, boomed across the dream, naming her son as king of men. In another version, she dreamt of a snake sliding between her legs, coiling around her belly like a living crown. She woke, trembling, and convinced of one thing. She was pregnant, and the child growing inside her had not been fathered by Philip. He was the son of a god. Olympias did not keep this belief to herself. In hushed tones to her priestesses, to select temple guards, and perhaps even to Philip himself in a rare moment of privacy, she repeated the dream. "The lightning chose me," she said. "The child is not yours alone." Philip, for his part, seemed amused, or irritated, or both. In the years to come, he would make a habit of mocking the story publicly, calling it a poetic excuse for infidelity. But privately, there is some evidence he believed it too, at least feared it. He had his own dream, after all, not long after hers. He claimed to have seen himself sealing his wife's womb with a lion-emblazoned signet ring, only to awaken and find her sleeping beside a great serpent. Perhaps it was just coincidence. Or perhaps Olympias, raised in a world where women had so little agency, knew exactly how to shape her myth. She began speaking of her unborn son with reverence before he even kicked, not as an heir, not as a prince, but as a child of fate, whose existence had been whispered by oracles. Its path would be drawn not on parchment, but in the smoke of sacrificed bulls. And when the baby came in a summer night in 356 BCE, while Philip was away conquering a minor city-state, the signs multiplied. That very night, Philip's army captured Pisidia. On the same day, word arrived from the temple of Artemis that it had burned to the ground. And far to the west, in Olympia, a famed athlete broke every record in the games. 3 omens in one day. And in the mind of a people primed to see meaning, in every flickering torch and shifting star, that could only mean one thing. Alexander was not just a child. He was destiny in swaddling cloth. Olympias reinforced the story. Stood told it 2 nurses, 2 guards, 2 traveling bards who came through. Pella. He was fathered by the king of gods, she would say, not smiling. I am only the vessel. She would hold the child and trace the line of his brow, as if to prove a divine hand had sculpted it. And so Alexander grew, not just in body, but in myth, even in his earliest years. He was taught to believe he was different, special, destined. His mother would sit beside him at night, recounting the tales of Achilles' supposed ancestor and whispering of gods who walked among men. But what does it mean for a child to believe he is the son of a god? Does it make him bold or dangerous? Okay? And what happens to a kingdom where myth and monarchy start to blur? Where power is no longer earned, but inherited through celestial dreams and fireborn wounds? When Philip returned to Pella and first saw the boy, he said nothing. He looked at him for a long time, and then, slowly, he turned to Olympias and said, "Well then, let us raise a god. But even gods must learn to walk, to speak, to understand the cold of marble floors beneath bare feet, and before the wars, before the legends, before the burning cities and broken empires." There was just a boy with dark hair and distant eyes, a boy who had already been told too many things about what he was supposed to become. But what if? What if he had never believed it? What if Olympias had kept her dream to herself? Would the world have been spared its most enduring conqueror? Asterisk in the quiet mornings of Pella, when the torches were extinguished and the marble columns still cast long shadows over the courtyards, Alexander would often be found alone. The palace had its share of noise training drills, traders shouting through the market, goats bleating somewhere beyond the stables, but the boy found corners to slip into, spaces where myth could breathe. By the time he could walk, servants whispered about his stillness. He did not cry easily. He did not play like other children. When given a toy, he would inspect it carefully, almost clinically, and then set it aside. His questions, even at 4 or 5, were not about sweets or games or riddles. He asked about stars, about the names of the horses, about which river led to the sea, and where the sea went next. Olympias fed these curiosities like a priestess tending sacred flame. She told him, again and again, that he was not like other boys, and she told others, tutors, advisors, dignitaries. He learns quickly because his mind is not clouded by mortal distractions. Philip, meanwhile, watched from a distance. His role as king drew him across the fractured landscape of Greece fighting, scheming, marrying again and again for alliances. But when he was home, he noticed his son, and it troubled him. It was not that he disbelieved in greatness. Philip had been raised in a rough court, taken hostage in Thebes, taught by generals and orators alike. He knew the value of boldness, but what he saw in Alexander was something else, something self-contained. The boy did not ask his father questions. He did not brag. He observed. There is a story, one of many, and perhaps truth, that when Alexander was just 10 years old, a mighty horse was brought to court. None could tame it, peaked and reared, refusing every rider. Philip, irritated, dismissed it as untrainable. Alexander stepped forward. "You are wrong," he said, softly. "He is afraid of his own shadow." And then, calmly, the boy turned the horse to face the sun so that its shadow fell behind. He mounted, and the horse obeyed. The court gasped. Philip, watching, is said to have wept. And then he spoke words that shaped the course of the boy's life. "Macedon is too small for you, my son. Seek a kingdom worthy of your ambition." Hey, and from that moment on, Alexander believed that he would. But ambition without guidance is a wild flame. So Philip made arrangements. He brought in tutor-skilled men of thought and letters. The most famous of these, of course, was Aristotle. Aristotle had been a student of Plato, and, unlike most court tutors, he did not fawn over royalty. He was a methodical man, known for his slow walks and structured mind. At first, he hesitated. The idea of tutoring a child who believed himself descended from gods did not sit well with a man grounded in reason. But the offer came with a generous stipend and a quiet retreat in Misa, where teaching could unfold outside the noisy palace. And so Aristotle began. He taught the boy about logic, ethics, natural science, and politics. But more than that, gave Alexander something Olympias never had: frameworks. If Olympias had filled Alexander's mind with myth, Aristotle gave it form. He taught him to question, to define, to understand the cause behind the story. When Olympias said the gods shaped the world, Aristotle asked, but what causes change in nature? When Olympias spoke of divine fire in her son's veins, Aristotle offered anatomy, and Alexander, caught between the two, learned to live with both truths. He could recite Homer by heart, but he could also argue persuasively the principles of governance or the classifications of marine life. He began to carry a dagger on one hip and a book on the other. His companions in Misasiski, Ptolemy, and others followed his lead, half in awe, half in silent competition. But none of them quite understood the way Alexander's mind worked. He wanted to know everything. He asked how Egyptian pyramids were built. He asked why some men ruled while others followed. He studied medicine, geography, astronomy. He examined every kind of plant and stone. And when Aristotle spoke of distant India and strange rivers that flowed backward in the monsoon, Alexander leaned forward. He did not just want to read about such things. He wanted to see them. But even as his mind stretched across the map of the known world, his life remained entangled in Macedonian politics. And Alexander, caught between the two, learned to live with both truths. He could recite Homer by heart, but he could also argue persuasively the principles of governance or the classifications of marine life. He began to carry a dagger on one hip and a book on the other. His companions in Misahipsion, Ptolemy, and others followed his lead, half in awe, half in silent competition. But none of them quite understood the way Alexander's mind worked. He wanted to know everything. He asked how Egyptian pyramids were built. He asked why some men ruled while others followed. He studied medicine, geography, astronomy. He examined every kind of plant and stone. And when Aristotle spoke of distant India and strange rivers that flowed backward in the monsoon, Alexander leaned forward. He did not just want to read about such things. He wanted to see them. But even as his mind stretched across the map of the known world, his life remained entangled in Macedonian politics. He was still a teenager when the world he knew began to tilt. By the time Alexander returned to court from Misa, his education under Aristotle nearly complete, Philip's palace was barely recognizable. Gone were the old rhythms of family power and quiet ritual. In their place stood the machinery of a rising empire. Marble halls filled with foreign dignitaries, columns of bronze armor lined along walkways, and maps, so many maps pinned to the walls, stretched across wooden tables, stained with spilled oil and sweat. Philip was planning something grand. He had unified much of Greece under the League of Corinth, cleverly positioning himself as hegemon rather than tyrant. And now the next step was clear. Persia, the great enemy across the sea, it had loomed large in Greek memory for generations. Darius, Xerxes, the burning of Athens. Philip wanted to invade not in vengeance, but in ambition. And for that, he needed two things: money and legacy. The money he had, through tribute, taxes, and the spoils of prior campaigns. The legacy that required more careful construction. He began preparing a wedding. Not his son's, his own. His seventh marriage. This time to a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra. Not the Egyptian one. This Cleopatra was of Philip's court. The marriage would solidify internal alliances, reassured the nobles and signaled to the Macedonian elite that the king's bloodline remained firmly domestic. Olympias was furious, not just because she was being replaced, but because this marriage would threaten Alexander's claim to the throne. Any children born of Philip and this new Cleopatra would have pure Macedonian blood in the eyes of the court. It's hard to say what Alexander felt. He had always stood in two worlds, part myth, part man, but he had never been politically naive. He saw the danger. He saw that he could be cast aside at the wedding feast, according to ancient sources. A drunken relative of Cleopatra stood and loudly proclaimed a toast to a legitimate heir. Alexander rose, quietly. Then he hurled a cup at the man's head. "You call me a bastard?" he shouted, the edge of his voice trembling not with fear, but with rage. Philip, drunk and enraged, stood and drew his sword. But he stumbled, fell. In fact, hit the ground. Alexander stared at him. "Here is the man," said coldly, "who would cross from Europe into Asia, and he cannot even walk from one table to another." And then he left. He left Pella, left the palace. For a time, seemed he might never return. But the gods or fate, or chance, had other plans. In the summer of 336 BCE, just as Philip was preparing to launch his grand campaign into Persia, he was assassinated at a wedding. Not his own this time, but his daughter's. The killer was one of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias, who stabbed him through the ribs before being cut down by other guards. To this day, historians debate the motive. Was it personal grievance? Political conspiracy? Some whisper that Olympias had arranged it. Others say Alexander himself knew it would happen. But what matters most is what came next. Philip was dead, and the boy who had once been told he was fathered by lightning suddenly stood at the center of power. There was no long coronation, no drawn-out process of ascension. Alexander moved quickly. He eliminated rivals, some through persuasion, others through steel. He solidified support among the Macedonian army, reminding them not just of his father's victories, but of his own divine bloodline. And then he wept. There are accounts, scattered, fragile, but persistent, that on the night after the funeral, Alexander sat alone in his chambers, surrounded by torches and scrolls and silence. He stared at the old dagger Philip had gifted him years before, not ornate, not gilded, simple iron and leather. He didn't sleep, didn't speak. He simply sat, and somewhere in the stillness, he made a decision. He would finish what Philip had started, but not just as a Macedonian king. He would cross into Asia, not as a conqueror, but as a living god. He began to trace his lineage more openly. Susammon, the ram-horned deity of Egypt, was now said to have fathered him directly. Wherever he went, so went the myth. In temples, they burned incense, not just to Athena and Apollo, but to Alexander himself. In the years to come, he would raise cities, build others, fight in deserts, bleed into rivers, and reach lands the Greeks had only ever imagined. But the beginning, the true beginning, was not the first battle. It was this moment, the quiet after a father's death, when a boy raised on prophecy realized the world would no longer wait for him to grow. He had to become the thing it had always been told he was. And that is the tragedy of Alexander, because whether or not Olympias truly believed her dream, whether or not lightning actually struck her womb, or gods whispered in her sleep, Ander believed it, and in believing, he became what the world expected him to be. But what would he have become if he had simply been allowed to be a boy? Would he have been happier? Or is that a question we no longer know how to ask? Asterisk, the palace at Pella was not the kind of place a child could get lost, and though Alexander often tried, it wasn't built for hiding. It was built for ruling. Cold stone, flat courtyards, long corridors where the sound of sandals on marble echoed. until even a whisper could feel like a proclamation. The walls were lined with painted panels and tapestries, but they told stories of conquest, of lawgivers, of gods with spears in hand and cities burning behind them. It was not a home, in the way a child might imagine. It was a training ground, a place where men shouted about borders and treaties, while boys were taught how to recite bloodlines from memory. And yet, Alexander found his own kind of rhythm there. He woke early, not because anyone made him, but because he preferred the quiet. Before the guards changed shifts, before the cooks started hauling bread loaves from clay ovens. There was a narrow window of silence in the early hours. Alexander liked to spend it alone. Sometimes he walked the length of the inner colonnade, counting each step between the pillars and noting the way the breeze moved through the open court. Other times he sat near the training grounds, where the dew still clung to the sand and straw, and watched the faintest silhouettes of soldiers drilling against the mist. He was not a loud child. He did not boast like some of the other noble boys. He didn't shove or provoke, but his silence was not passivity, but it was calculation. He absorbed everything. By the age of 7, he had already begun formal instruction. Literacy in both Greek and the local Macedonian dialect came first, not for pleasure, but for necessity. A ruler had to read treaties, review reports, understand codes. His handwriting was neat, narrow, and compressed, efficient. His tutors quickly discovered something unusual. Alexander not only remembered what he read, he remembered the way the pages smelled. He would say things like, "That's the scroll that smelled of sandalwood, not the one with the wax stain." It was as if his mind cataloged each lesson, not just in words, but in texture and scent. He showed early preference for Homer's Iliad, which was unsurprising. All boys of noble blood were taught the old epics, but while others read it to imitate heroes, Alexander read it to understand them. He questioned Achilles' pride. He debated whether Hector had truly lost or simply been born into the wrong side of history. He once asked a startled tutor whether Agamemnon had truly earned his authority, or whether the gods had simply tolerated him. The dagger came later. It was given to him not as a weapon, but as a symbol. A small, well-balanced blade with a hilt of carved bone. He wore it every day thereafter in his belt. Beside the scroll case, he never went without. Thus the habit formed, a dagger and a book, always together. The soldiers joked about it. "He'll quote Plato as he cuts your throat," they said. But there was respect in their voices. This was no soft boy playing at king. Even then, Alexander practiced with the spear and the sword, not with joy necessarily, but with focus. His body was wiry, not heavy with muscle, but precise. He could outlast others in sparring simply by refusing to tire. By the time he was 10, he knew how to read Persian merchant tallies and how to calculate the logistics of feeding an army of 5,000 men for a 3-day march. He knew the difference between bronze forged in Pella and the harder alloys that came from Thessaly. He could name the generals of every major Greek city, state, and trace. Their failures as though he had lived through them. Yet it was the mundane that made up most of his days. He sat in dusty rooms, copying passages until his fingers cramped. He stood at attention during long meetings of the Macedonian court, listening to older men bicker about taxes and border disputes. He watched animals being sacrificed in temple courtyards, an act that bored him more than it moved him. He often asked his nursemaids to bring him stories, not new ones, but the same ones over and over, not for comfort, but for dissection. He wanted to understand how myths were built. What made a hero when others his age wanted to sneak into kitchens for honey cakes? He wanted to sneak into the archives to read tax records from decades past. He once asked a clerk how many loaves of bread it took to keep the palace fed each week. When the man gave a rough estimate, Alexander returned a day later with corrected numbers. having quietly consulted the pantry ledger and done the arithmetic himself. But it was not just numbers that preoccupied him. There was something else. Something quieter, a restlessness. He would stare at the mountains beyond the city and ask about what lay beyond them. He studied traders when they arrived in town, watched the wear on their boots, stains on their tunics, the faded tattoos from lands far away. One day, he saw a map that showed the edges of India, drawn faintly in guesswork ink. He asked if it was real. No one knows, the cartographer had said. It's drawn from rumor. Alexander stared at it for a long time. Then I'll find it, he said, and redraw it properly. He was 10 years old. These are not the moments that make it into most retellings of Alexander's life. The bloodied sieges, the burning cities, the grand speeches. That's what history prefers. But history is built in stillness, in the boy who wakes up early just to listen to silence, in the child who holds a dagger in one hand and a scroll in the other and wonders which one will be more useful in the years to come. He would later be remembered as the man who could not be stopped, but once, long before the world knelt before him. He was just a quiet boy sitting in a sunlit courtyard, asking why all the old maps stopped at the edge of the river and why no one had ever kept walking. Asterisk, the year before Philip's assassination. The palace at Pella began to shift in tone slightly at first, then all at once. There was a new urgency in the halls. More messengers, or maps. More silences, in between sentences. Alexander noticed. He was 16, nearly a man in Macedonian terms, but still a student under Aristotle's extended mentorship. Their lessons had grown more political, less about the structure of the natural world, more about the structure of power. What is a just ruler? Alexander asked one afternoon. Aristotle looked at him carefully. The one who knows that justice is not a fixed point. Alexander said nothing. Later that evening, he wrote a short line in the margin of a wax tablet. Justice is a moving wall. He was beginning to understand what would be required of him. Philip, for all his brilliance, had made many enemies. His campaigns were efficient, but not clean. He left behind blood and bruised pride in every corner of Greece. His alliances were often forged with iron and sealed with shallow handshakes. And now, Philip had begun to look eastward. Persia, the old enemy, the impossible goal. Alexander had read enough to know what that meant. An empire with deeper coffers, broader lands, and a more entrenched court than anything Macedonia had ever faced. But to his father was a crown worth chasing. He prepared a massive wedding for his daughter, inviting leaders from every corner of the Greek world. It was more than a celebration. It was a demonstration. Macedon, under Philip, is now the beating heart of a newly ordered world. Alexander was not at the center of that celebration. He stood at the edge of it watching, calculating. There were rumors Philip would name a new heir, Taps, a son born from his new Macedonian queen, Cleopatra, perhaps a cousin more acceptable to the old noble families. Alexander knew. His place was no longer guaranteed. He began preparing in silence. He strengthened ties with generals who respected his early command. In minor campaigns, he met with temple priests in private, showing they still remembered the old stories Olympias had planted. He did not protest publicly, that was not his way. Instead, he waited. He went on long rides with Hephaestion, often in silence. He practiced, alone in the smaller courtyard, after the others had gone to sleep. And then, without warning, it happened. Philip was dead, a blade between the ribs. At the very ceremony meant to display Macedon's unity. The assassin was killed almost immediately, but not before the damage was done. The kingdom held its breath. Power in Macedon did not transition automatically. It could be challenged. Alexander moved fast. He dressed in black, but did not weep. He stood in the palace hall, sword at his side. Hey, and addressed the generals before the body was even cold. I am the son of Philip, he said, and of Zeus. That was all. It was enough. The generals, weary of instability, pledged loyalty. The priest, still under Olympia's long shadow, confirmed the omens. And the palace clerks resumed their endless writing. Now, under a new seal, Alexander was king. He was just 20 years old, but the man he had become had been in the making for a long time. From the first scroll he read beneath torchlight, from the first dagger he strapped to his hip, from the nights he walked barefoot through the gardens, whispering lines from Homer into the dark. He did not inherit the throne. He had shaped himself for it. Now he would shape the world, but how much of him still belonged to himself? A boy raised on prophecy, a youth schooled in cold strategies, a mind sharpened by Aristotle, but haunted by Olympias. Did he ever stop to wonder what he might have been if no one had told him he was meant to rule? Or had the thought itself become too dangerous to entertain? Asterisk, he did not arrive with a trumpet, or a scroll of royal praise, or a train of attendants bearing gifts. He came quietly on a dust-covered mule, with a bundle of worn books strapped beneath the saddle, and more creases on his face than the maps in Philip's war room. Aristotle, son of Nicomachus, a Macedonian by birth, but an Athenian in mind. He had studied under Plato at the academy in Athens, spent years debating metaphysics with men who named stars and assigned categories to things as simple as wind and as complex as love. And yet, here he was, in the half-wild northern kingdom of Macedon, summoned not to argue, but to teach, not to a school. The boy, Alexander Philip, had made the offer personally, though some say it was Olympias who insisted. Not just any tutor, she said, the best. If her son was to fulfill the destiny she had always whispered about, he would need more than military training and royal etiquette. He would need philosophia, the love of wisdom. So the king made his request. Hint, Aristotle, perhaps bored of Athens or weary of its politics, grade. But he did not come to the palace. He insisted that teaching happen elsewhere, somewhere quiet. Removed, they chose Mysa, a grove not far from the capital, known for its shaded walks and ruined stone buildings. It was once a place of worship. It would become a school. There were no blackboards, no desks, only benches, scrolls, trees older than any man alive, and a 12-year-old boy who had already memorized Homer and asked questions with a strange, unnerving stillness. Alexander didn't speak much during their first meetings. He listened, watched. He expected grand pronouncements. Instead, Aristotle asked him to observe a beetle crawling across the bark of a fig tree. What do you see? Alexander frowned. A bug. Aristotle smiled slightly. Look again. And thus the lessons began, not with empires, but with tiny things. How a beetle carries weight 10 times its size. How water bends light. Why shadows change shape depending on the hour. Alexander learned to question everything. Not in rebellion, but in refinement. If a thing was said to be true, he was taught to ask, by whom, in what conditions, according to which principles. Titus and Thucydides, not to memorize, but to critique. Was it wise, Aristotle would ask, for Xerxes to bridge the Hellespont with boats? Alexander, arms crossed, might answer, it was bold. But he lacked the loyalty of his own men. They debated this for hours, sometimes under the trees, sometimes in candlelit chambers where moths brushed against papyrus scrolls and the air smelled of beeswax and dust. The boy's mind was sharp already, formidable before Aristotle arrived, but under the philosopher's guidance, it became surgical. He learned logic, the syllogism. K learned ethics not as commandments, but as questions of balance. He He learned biology, astronomy, meteorology. He learned that the stars were not gods, but spheres, that the heart did not think, but the brain did. But more than that, he learned how to think, and Aristotle learned too. At first, he tried to teach as he had been taught, from texts in lecture, but Alexander resisted that. He preferred movement, conversation. He remembered everything but hated rote, so Aristotle adapted. He taught while walking, talking, testing. Sometimes Alexander would interrupt with a question that had no answer. If a man knows he is meant to rule, but does not want to, is he still just? Aristotle would pause, then smile. Let's walk, and they would. Mysa became their shared kingdom, the quiet place where philosophy met ambition. Other boys were there, Ptolemy, Hephaestion, Cassander, but Alexander remained the center. Not because he demanded it, but because his focus was absolute. He would not allow distractions. He was the first to arrive for lessons, the last to leave. Even on days when war news reached the Grove Philip, winning another border skirmish or crushing a rebellion in Thessaly, Alexander did not flinch. He studied, because he understood something few boys did. Every battle begins in the mind. But there were limits to even Aristotle's reach. The philosopher taught moderation, the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies between excess and deficiency. Alexander listened, took notes, quoted the principles back flawlessly, but something in him resisted it. He did not want to be balanced. He wanted to be great. When they studied the life of Achilles, Aristotle emphasized his flaws, his rage, his pride. Alexander nodded. But that night, he still placed a copy of the Iliad beneath his pillow, because, for all the logic and reason, part of him still needed the fire, the divine, the destiny, and that is what made their relationship so strange, so rare. One taught clarity. The other chased glory. One believed in limits, the other in conquest, but they never clashed, not openly, because both knew that the boy's mind was still forming, and that their time together would be brief. Eventually, scrolls would be traded for swords, but in those short years, a foundation was laid, not of mercy, not of kindness, but of clarity, and clarity in the hands of a future king is a dangerous thing, because it makes ambition feel like a solution rather than a risk, and power seem like the only logical outcome. But could a teacher who believed in reason ever truly prepare a boy who believed he was born to rule the world? Asterisk. By the time Alexander turned 13, he had learned more about the natural world than most full-grown generals. Not from rote memorization or theological dictates, but through what Aristotle called episteme, systematic knowledge. At Mysa, under the shade of whispering fig trees, the lessons had shifted. No longer just about the stars or the anatomy of birds. They had become tangled in darker questions: justice, tyranny, the nature of governance. Aristotle did not raise his voice. He asked questions, drew comparisons, let silence hang like a blade in the air until the boy answered. Alexander responded, not like a pupil, but like a rival. Not rude, never rude, but increasingly confident, testing the edges of every concept offered. If tyranny is bad, he once asked, why do men tolerate it if it brings peace? Aristotle had nodded, because most men prefer safety to agency. Even the wise are tempted to trade freedom for order. Alexander leaned forward, his voice low. Then, are we ruled by fear or by hope? Aristotle's only reply: both, depending on which one your enemies lack. These weren't theoretical discussions. A tease. Philip's ambitions were now clearer than ever. Macedon was no longer just defending itself. It was preparing to lead, to press into Persia, to expand. Alexander, even as a student, could sense what was coming. And he knew that battles were never won with weapons alone. So, Aristotle began teaching him politics in its truest sense, not elections or party lines, but the movement of people, the pressure of ideas, the mechanics of control. They studied city constitutions, both functional and failed. Sparta's rigid militarism. Athens' democracy by debate. Corinth's merchant pragmatism. The rise and fall of Thebes. Alexander absorbed them like a sponge pressed against oil. He noted which cities had survived war, which fell to internal conflict, which leaders had inspired loyalty, which ruled by fear. Aristotle would mark the pages of treaties and constitutions, underlining passages in red. But Alexander made different notes in the margins calm. Quiet observations like, too many voices make weak decisions. The loudest man is not always the leader. Better to be remembered than liked. He was not becoming a philosopher. He was becoming something else, student of power in its rawest form. Aristotle saw it. He tried to temper it. He introduced concepts like eudaimonia, life well lived, fulfilled through virtue. He taught moderation, how the best leaders avoided extremes. But Alexander listened to these ideas with the same detached expression he used when studying anatomy. Useful, but perhaps not necessary. He did not believe his life would be moderate, and in that he was probably right. Still, there were moments when the teachings landed. One evening, after a long day of lessons, Aristotle walked with Alexander through the orchard. The air was thick with the scent of ripening olives. "Do you believe I'll be a good king?" the boy asked. Aristotle paused. "Only if you remember that kingship is a service, not a right." Alexander didn't reply at first. He looked up at the sky, where stars were beginning to blink into place like old eyes opening. "My mother says the gods chose me." Aristotle nodded. "And do you believe that?" The boy thought for a long time. "I don't know. But if they didn't, then I'll have to prove it every day." Aristotle, for once, had no correction to offer. They continued walking, but the balance between them was beginning to shift. The lessons were no longer intellectual. They were personal. Alexander began to challenge Aristotle more directly on ethics, on loyalty, even on history. "Why do we call some men great?" he asked one morning, pacing beneath the colonnade. "Is it because of what they do, or because others are too afraid to forget them?" Aristotle's answer was precise. Greatness without wisdom becomes cruelty. Alexander nodded. But wisdom without courage becomes silence. It was not defiance. It was clarity, and it worried Aristotle, because even the best teachings are subject to interpretation. And in Alexander, he saw not a philosopher king, but a man who might use reason to justify anything to him. Alexander's strength lay not just in strategy or swordplay, but in justification, the ability to make any action sound necessary, even moral. There was one debate that never resolved. It concerned hubris, excessive pride, the flaw that brought down even the most gifted men. Aristotle insisted that hubris was a corruption of virtue, a shadow masquerading as greatness. Alexander countered that to shape history. A man must believe in his own myth even if others call it arrogance. Would Achilles have been remembered, he asked, if he had bowed to Agamemnon? No, Aristotle admitted, but perhaps he would have lived longer. Alexander shrugged. What is long life if it has no shape? The conversation ended there. Neither spoke of it again, but the thought lingered, because somewhere beneath all the scrolls and strategies, Alexander had already made a decision. He would not seek balance, He would not aim for moderation. He would chase something larger, not just to rule, but to be remembered. And Aristotle, for all his brilliance, could not teach him how to carry that weight, because that wasn't his philosophy. That was something else, something closer to burden than ambition. But could any teacher ever reach a boy who believed the world itself was waiting to be rewritten by his hand. Asterisk. The final days at Misa were strangely quiet. There were no grand ceremonies, no final lecture carved in marble. Just the rustle of scrolls being packed away, the faint crack of dry leaves underfoot, and the sound of young men preparing to become something else. Alexander was nearly 16. He was being recalled to Pella to act as regent while Philip led a campaign in Thrace. It was a test, a sign of trust, a sign of transition. Hephaestion and Ptolemy were already mounting their horses. They joked quietly, trying to mask the weight of change. But Alexander did not joke. He stood with Aristotle neath the old fig tree where they'd first studied the beetle and the bark. There are no records of what was said that day, only fragments. Some say Aristotle offered him a final warning. You are not the law. Remember that? Others claim Alexander thanked him, simply and without flourish. Perhaps both are true. What we do know is this: Aristotle did not accompany him back to court. Their lessons, formal or otherwise, were over. The philosopher returned to his own studies. Eventually, he would found the Lyceum in Athens. He would write his treatises on ethics, politics, logic, and metaphysics. He would teach other students, none of them quite like the boy from Pella, but Alexander carried those lessons with him, even when he was crowned king 2 years later, even when he crossed into Asia. In his saddlebag, it said, he carried a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle himself. He slept with it beside his sword. He still quoted the philosopher in council meetings, though more rarely as time passed. What Aristotle taught him had not been doctrine. It had been structured how to think, how to weigh, how to question. But the answers Alexander reached were his own when he raised thieves. It was not out of anger, but strategy. He remembered lessons on fear and precedent, on what one act can echo across a dozen borders. When he began styling himself as the son of Zuzaman in Egypt, some say it was arrogance. Others say it was myth-making, okay? But those who remembered his studies knew better. He was building a narrative one that drew from Homer, from Herodotus, from the very texts Aristotle had given him. But he used them not to reflect, but to construct. He did not ask if he was just. He asked what justice would look like in his name. He did not ask whether he was right. He asked how many would remember. And yet, even as he built cities and crossed deserts, some of the old lessons returned to him. In moments of stillness, one such moment came after the siege of Tyre. It had been brutal. 7 months, walls broken stone by stone, thousands killed, survivors crucified along the shore. Afterward, Alexander stood atop the ruined city, staring at the sea. A courtier approached and asked what tribute should be carved into the marble. Alexander, silent for a time, finally said, "Nothing about victory, just the tide." The man frowned. The tide. A cryptic answer, but perhaps a philosophical one. Perhaps he was remembering something Aristotle once said, that history is not a ladder, but a wheel. Or perhaps he had simply grown weary, because for all the conquests, Alexander never returned to Misa, never wrote long letters to Aristotle. Their parting had been real. Final dot teacher and student had diverged. One returned to theory. The other became the subject of it. And what of the man who had tried to teach moderation to a storm? What did Aristotle think, as the boy he once taught built an empire of fire and iron? Did he regret the lessons? Or did he understand that some minds, once lit, cannot help but burn? There's a quiet tragedy in every parting, but the tragedy here is not that the teacher and student grew apart. It's that the student had already learned too well. He knew the names of all the virtues and how to turn them, one by one, into tools. But in the end, could a teacher truly shape a boy who never wanted to be human in the first place? Asterisk. Before the maps and the war plans, before the treaties and the siege towers. Life in ancient Macedon began with breakfast. Breakfast began with barley, not golden wheat, not figs soaked in honey, not roasted meats or clusters of grapes ripened on southern vines. Barley, crushed, soaked, baked into loaves, dense enough to dull a blade. It was not the food of kings, it was the food of a people who lived close to the ground. Macedon, even under Philip's rising ambitions, was still a rugged land. Hills more than roads, soldiers more than scholars. The soil grew what it could, and barley was reliable. It's cheap, fast-growing, stubborn in bad weather, and so it fed the court just as it fed the field hands. The palace kitchens began their day before the sun broke the horizon. Clay ovens were stoked with olive branches, and the grinding stones turned slowly. The servants crushed the previous day's barley into flour. No yeast, no spices, just water, salt, and patience. The resulting loaves were small, flat, and heavy, not quite crisp, not quite soft. They were sometimes referred to as maza, a term shared with other parts of the Greek-speaking world. Though in Macedon the recipe lacked the refinements found further south. Breakfast was not social, it was functional. The courtiers ate in silence. So did the scribes. So did the soldiers on early watch, even the royal household. Despite its wealth and power, held to a kind of quiet discipline in the mornings. There were no long banquets before noon, no music, no idle gossip over fruit platters. Alexander, as a child, ate the same way. His day began with barley bread and diluted wine. Sometimes there were olives, brined to near bitterness, occasionally dried figs, but rarely more than that. He ate quickly, often standing, already reviewing the scrolls or weapons he would carry through the day. He was not taught to linger, and the silence wasn't just a matter of custom. It was strategic. In a palace where ambitions churned behind every door, where loyalties could shift like dust in sunlight. Silence was a form of armor. To speak during breakfast was to risk showing one's thoughts too early. A poorly timed question, a comment overheard by the wrong ears, it could be remembered, repeated, and used. And so, the halls echoed only with the clink of knives, the soft tear of bread, and the sound of men chewing quietly. Eyes cast downward. The utensils were blunt. Not because sharper ones weren't available, but because blades at breakfast were a risk. There were rumors, never confirmed, of a cousin of Philip's, who once tried to stab a rival during the morning meal. After that, knives were dulled, and guards watched more closely. Even the guards ate in shifts, half at a time, always watching. For commoners, breakfast was simpler still. Barley porridge, served lukewarm. If one was lucky, it might be drizzled with a few drops of olive oil. For children, goat's milk mixed with grain mush. They ate outdoors when possible, on stones, on steps, on the bare ground. It filled the belly. Nothing more, but it taught something too. Restraint. There was no sugar to spike energy. No sweet breads to coddle. Just endurance. It's the kind that settled low in the stomach and lasted through hours of work, marching, or study. This was the Macedonia that raised Alexander. A land where even food obeyed the laws of necessity. Later, in Persia, he would taste exotic fruits wrapped in silk, lamb roasted with spices he couldn't name, and wine so thick it was nearly syrup, but none of it replaced the habit. Even during campaigns, he insisted on simple meals. Barley, if possible. Bread, without ornament. He said it kept him clear, dash-headed, perhaps. Or, perhaps, it was a kind of tether to the boy he had been before he became myth. To the palace mornings when he stood in a stone room, breaking off a piece of bread with his fingers, and chewing in silence while the world outside the palace slowly woke. There is a tendency to focus on the dramatic, the battles, the declarations, the betrayals, but often The most revealing truths hide in the dullest moments, like breakfast, because a man who learns to endure hunger without complaint, who learns to wait until the second bell before speaking, who begins his day in silence, with coarse bread and a dulled knife. Such a man does not crave luxury, he craves control. And if history is a table, then what kind of world is built by those who were taught never to speak during the first meal of the day? Asterisk, by mid-morning in the palace at Pella, the smell of burnt barley crust would fade into the dry scent of lime-washed walls and sweat-soaked tunics. Breakfast was over. The loaves had been cleared, the wine diluted to water and drunk down without comment. Servants moved quickly to sweep away the crumbs. No one lingered, because breakfast was never the point. It was the threshold, once crossed. The palace snapped into function for young men like Alexander. The day shifted swiftly into its rhythms of training, instruction, and ritual. But beneath the obvious activity soared drills in the courtyard, syllogisms under Aristotle's gaze, reports murmured in corridors. There was another lesson being taught, more subtle and enduring, that food is not pleasure, it is preparation, and hunger is not weakness. It is a rehearsal. In the barracks, soldiers were given the same barley bread as the royal table, though with less olive oil and no figs. They ate seated on stone benches or kneeling in the dirt, heads bowed, hands never idle. Some used chunks of bread as spoons to scoop porridge, or as pouches to hold dried onion. There was no seasoning, no variety, no indulgence, because breakfast was not a reward, it was training. Even the youngest squires were taught this at 10 or 11. A boy might wake, shivering on a straw mat, pull on a tunic still damp from the night air, and be handed a bowl of cold barley, mashed sticky, bland, faintly sour. If he wrinkled his nose or gagged, the older boys laughed. The instructors frowned. Learn to eat like a man, they'd say, or you'll die crying in the dust. No one comforted them, because Macedonian mornings were not about comfort. They were about tolerance. You learned to chew slowly, swallow, without complaint, to keep your expression still. Even pain had to wait until after breakfast. The records from that time few, though they speak little of meals, but every mention is telling. One traveler described Macedonian breakfast as a meal not of fullness, but a function, noting that even nobles eat like their boots are already laced. Another, a disgraced Athenian poet, exiled to the north, complained bitterly in a letter, "The bread is a rock, the wine a stain, the people quiet as funerals. I dream of fruit, and they dream of iron." For Alexander, this sparse table was formative. He would later adopt Persian customs when it suited him, taking on dress, title, even gesture, but he never adopted Persian meals. He remained wary of indulgence in one campaign. During the long, hot march through the Jedrosian desert, he refused water when his men had none. A scout had found a small pouch of muddy liquid in a goat skin and offered it to the king. Alexander looked at the man, then looked at the army behind him, parched, sunburnt, blistered. He poured the water onto the sand, not to waste it too. Equalize, to remind them, the king eats last, and drinks even later. These were not spontaneous acts of charisma. They were habits formed in childhood, in the palace kitchens. Young boys of noble blood were sometimes made to prepare their own morning meal. It was not a punishment, it was a lesson. Do you understand effort? To smell the grain. Teased, to stir the dough until their arms ached. Alexander learned the weight of bread before he ever learned the weight of a sword, and he learned to wait. Sometimes, breakfast was withheld as discipline, not from cruelty, but from principle. A missed lesson, a mistake in the training yard, an act of arrogance. The boy would come to the hall, find the table cleared, and be told calmly, "Tomorrow He would bow, not argue. Then go about his day, hungrier than usual, but not broken, because in Macedon, hunger was just another way of sharpening the will. Later, in life, when others feasted after victories, Alexander often ate alone, with little more than a crust of bread and wine thinned to vinegar. His generals would whisper, confused, but he understood. Feasting weakens, hunger refines. Even among his most trusted companions, he rarely allowed indulgence in the morning's downs. When a young officer dared request honey cakes before a march, Alexander is said to have replied, "Do you plan to ride your appetite into battle?" The cakes never arrived. There's a curious legacy in this philosophy. The notion that restraint is more powerful than strength, that a man who controls his stomach may someday control an empire. And while philosophers like Aristotle might have framed it in more elegant terms, discipline, temperance, moderation, the truth was baked daily into the blackened crusts of barley loaves in palace kitchens. That bread was not made to delight. It was made to last, and perhaps so was Alexander. But if a boy is raised to greet every morning in silence, to chew without smiling, to suppress comfort in favor of control, what does that do to his joy? Is it still possible to enjoy anything? Does everything become a means to an end? Asterisk in the final section of the day. Long after the sun had risen and the dust had begun to settle over palace courtyards, the morning meal was already forgotten. The barley loaves had been eaten, the crumbs swept away, the dull knives returned to the shelves. But what remained, the residue of habit, of discipline, quiet deprivation, was harder to clean. Macedonian breakfasts were designed to disappear. No one remembered the exact taste. That wasn't the point, okay? The meal wasn't a memory. It was a framework, okay? Pattern that repeated until it became invisible. Alexander carried that pattern with him into adulthood, into campaigns, into cities and deserts, and feasts and funerals. In the world noticed when he crossed into Asia Minor. One of the first impressions he made on the Persian and Greek observers wasn't his armor or his horses. It was his habits. He woke early. He ate sparingly. He rarely indulged. At first, his enemies thought this was posturing, an act. But months passed, then years, and still the stories came that the king of Macedon ate barley while others ate grapes, okay? That he drank water when generals requested wine, okay? That he sat in silence at dawn while musicians tuned instruments for banquets he never attended. Some tried to imitate him. They failed, because habits built from childhood are hard to fake. There was one moment, during the Indian campaign, when a local chieftain, hoping to flatter Fort Alexander a lavish breakfast, sweet flatbreads, soaked in clarified butter, rich goat's milk, soft cheese, fruit so ripe it bled sugar. Alexander examined the tray in silence, then took only a small piece of flatbread, ate it without expression. He later asked his aide to gift the rest of the meal to the scouts. The aide asked, "Was it not good enough for you?" Alexander replied, "It was too good." That's the problem. 'Cause he understood what many rulers forget. Indulgence weakens intention. The more accustomed one becomes to pleasure, the less equipped one is for hardship. And hardship, in Macedon, was never far away, even in the palace especially. In the palace, discomfort was part of the design. Rooms were not overly warm in winter or cool in summer. Robes were plain in the mornings, footwear simple. The floor beneath the breakfast benches was bare stone. No rugs, no cushions. Even the king, Philip, followed these routines. Not because he was ascetic, but because he understood what kept men sharp, and he wanted his son sharper still. Olympias, too, followed the rhythm, though she was given private attendants, fine oils, and preferred richer foods in the evening. She never intervened in Alexander's morning routines. Anything, she encouraged them. She once told a maid, "Let the gods feed him in dreams. Bread will do until then." It was a cold sort of love, but perhaps the only kind the world allowed her to give, because to raise a king in Macedon was not to nurture, it was to shape. And shaping happens through repetition, through daily discomfort, through the long, slow refusal of ease. This is the part of Alexander's life that rarely finds its way into legend. Not the battles or the speeches, but the act of sitting on a hard bench, chewing dry barley before the sun finishes rising, and not complaining, because there is something in that, something more enduring than empire. A man who can govern his hunger is often more feared than one who governs a city, because he is not ruled by what he desires. He is ruled by what he endures. In later years, after his death, when stories about Alexander multiplied like rumors in a marketplace, many of them focused on the grand, the Gordian knot, the siege of Tyre, the march through the Hindu Kush, but some remembered the smaller things, that he woke early, that he ate simply, that he never asked for more than the bare minimum to start his day. One general recalled a morning outside Babylon when Alexander stood barefoot in the dust, eating a crust of barley bread while watching birds pick seeds from a broken wagon. He watched them for 10 minutes, said nothing, then handed the last of his bread to the youngest page and walked on. There was no speech, no lesson, but the gesture was remembered long after the speeches were forgotten, because there, in the silence of breakfast, was the essence of the man, not the god, not the conqueror, just the boy who had learned early that hunger is not a punishment, it's a practice. But can a man raised on such austerity ever allow himself peace, or does he wake every morning, even in victory, still chewing, as if the war hasn't ended? Asterisk, there are no songs about the night before, no epics carved into temple walls to describe how soldiers lay in the dark, wrapped in wool that smelled of sheep and mildew. Try not to think about the next day's blood, but it is there, in that silence, that war begins, before the charge, before the trumpet, before the orders barked through rising dust. It begins in the dark, on the ground, with men who cannot sleep. The army of Macedons, still raw, still untested, had made camp in a narrow valley on the edge of what is now remembered as northern Thessaly. The terrain was dry, but not desert. The dirt packed hard. Sparse shrubs offered no shade. The air smelled of sweat and dying grass. Alexander was not yet king. He was 17, acting as regent, while his father, Philip, pursued northern campaigns. This particular skirmish miner, by the standards of later history, was, at the time, everything. A nearby city-state had rebelled. Mercenaries had been hired. Tensions threatened to undo what Philip had just spent a decade building down. And now, young Alexander was about to command soldiers in battle for the first time. But not yet. Not until dawn. For now, it was only the night, and the thousand small discomforts that come with it. Most soldiers slept in pairs or trios, huddled for warmth, despite the season. The ground was uneven, rocks jabbing between shoulder blades and hips. Some had cloaks, others only worn tunics. The lucky ones laid reed mats or old wool between their bodies and the dirt. Few could sleep. They whispered, coughed, shifted. Some prayed quietly, with hands pressed to the soil, mouthing the names of gods they barely believed in. Others stared at the stars. In those moments, rank faded. Even veterans muttered to themselves, like boys, because fear does not respect experience, and no matter how many drills they'd done, how many times they'd practiced formations, the truth lingered in the silence. Tomorrow, some of them would die. There is no training that prepares a man to lie on his back and wonder whether the breath he just took might be among his last. The campfires were small and few. Flames were rationed as tightly as food. Smoke drew attention, and in this part of the country, attention could be fatal. So the night was dark, not poetically, so just practically. The kind of dark that makes shadows melt into each other. The kind of dark that feels cold, even when the air is warm. Alexander did not sleep either. He walked the perimeter, slowly, alone. He refused a cloak. He carried no torch. He paused every few minutes to look at the faces of the men on the ground. Not to speak, to see them. He walked not like a king, but like a man searching for something. And perhaps he was great, maybe, or clarity. Or perhaps he was simply afraid, and trying not to let it show. He passed by a soldier barely older than himself, muttering in a low voice something about his mother. The words were soft, not a prayer, to memory. Alexander kept walking. A veteran nearby sat upright, grinding his teeth. He had a chipped helmet balanced beside him like a sleeping dog. Rest, the soldier muttered when he saw Alexander. You'll need it. Alexander paused. Do you? The man shrugged. I've learned to live without it. Alexander didn't smile, but he nodded. He walked on. He stopped near the edge of camp, where the scouts rested, and looked toward the valley beyond. The hills were quiet. The enemy unseen, but close. A commander approached from behind. Quiet, but not silent enough. You should sleep, my lord. Alexander shook his head. Sleep belongs to those who can afford ignorance. The commander did not press the issue. Instead, they stood together for a while, saying nothing. The stillness wasn't peace. It was pressure, waiting, doubt, slowly turning into decision. Somewhere behind them, a man was retching. Too much bad wine, or too much fear. Another was whispering to a small wooden charm he wore around his neck. Someone coughed until it turned into a sob. None of it was unusual. This was the ritual before the ritual. The slow unraveling of calm before the storm of orders, of shields clashing and knees shaking beneath leather armor. And somewhere in that long night, Alexander finally sat. Not in a tent, but on the dirt. Back straight, hands on his knees. He didn't close his eyes. Instead, he whispered to himself lines from the Iliad, perhaps, or from Aristotle, or maybe from nothing at all. Words to fill the silence, to keep the doubt from growing too loud. And there, in the dark, he became something else. Not a child, not yet a king, just a boy surrounded by men. Trying not to show that he was afraid of failing them, because tomorrow, when the sun rose, they would follow him, and he needed them to believe, even if he wasn't sure yet what he believed himself. But what kind of leader is shaped by a night without sleep? And what is it that men really fight for when the silence finally breaks? And while philosophers like Aristotle might have framed it in more elegant terms, discipline, temperance, moderation, the truth was baked daily into the blackened crusts of barley loaves in palace kitchens. That bread was not made to delight. It was made to last, and perhaps so was Alexander. But if a boy is raised to greet every morning in silence, to chew without smiling, to suppress comfort in favor of control, what does that do to his joy? Is it still possible to enjoy anything? Does everything become a means to an end? Asterisk in the final section of the day. Long after the sun had risen and the dust had begun to settle over palace courtyards, the morning meal was already forgotten. The barley loaves had been eaten, the crumbs swept away, the dull knives returned to the shelves. But what remained, the residue of habit, of discipline, of quiet deprivation, was harder to clean. Macedonian breakfasts were designed to disappear. No one remembered the exact taste. That wasn't the point, okay? The meal wasn't a memory. It was a framework, okay? Pattern that repeated until it became invisible. Alexander carried that pattern with him into adulthood, into campaigns, into cities and deserts, and feasts and funerals. And the world noticed when he crossed into Asia Minor. One of the first impressions he made on the Persian and Greek observers wasn't his armor or his horses. It was his habits. He woke early. He ate sparingly. He rarely indulged. At first, his enemies thought this was posturing, an act. But months passed, then years, and still, the stories came that the king of Macedon ate barley, while others ate grapes, okay? That he drank water when generals requested wine, okay? That he sat in silence at dawn while musicians tuned instruments for banquets he never attended. Some tried to imitate him. They failed, because habits built from childhood are hard to fake. There was one moment, kid, during the Indian campaign, when a local chieftain, hoping to flatter Fort Alexander a lavish breakfast, sweet flatbreads, soaked in clarified butter, rich goat's milk, soft cheese, fruit so ripe it bled sugar. Alexander examined the tray in silence, then took only a small piece of flatbread, ate it without expression. He later asked his aide to gift the rest of the meal to the scouts. The aide asked, "Was it not good enough for you?" Alexander replied, "It was too good." That's the problem. 'Cause he understood what many rulers forget. Indulgence weakens intention. The more accustomed one becomes to pleasure, the less equipped one is for hardship. And hardship, in Macedon, was never far away, even in the palace especially. In the palace, discomfort was part of the design. Rooms were not overly warm in winter or cool in summer. Robes were plain in the mornings, footwear simple. The floor beneath the breakfast benches was bare stone. No rugs, no cushions. Even the king, Philip, followed these routines. Not because he was ascetic, but because he understood what kept men sharp, and he wanted his son sharper still. Olympias, too, followed the rhythm, though she was given private attendants, fine oils, and preferred richer foods in the evening. She never intervened in Alexander's morning routines. Anything, she encouraged them. She once told a maid, "Let the gods feed him in dreams." Bread would do until then. It was a cold sort of love, but perhaps the only kind the world allowed her to give, because to raise a king in Macedon was not to nurture, it was to shape. And shaping happens through repetition, through daily discomfort, through the long, slow refusal of ease. This is the part of Alexander's life that rarely finds its way into legend. Not the battles or the speeches, but the act of sitting on a hard bench, chewing dry barley before the sun finishes rising, and not complaining, because there is something in that, something more enduring than empire. A man who can govern his hunger is often more feared than one who governs a city, because he is not ruled by what he desires. He is ruled by what he endures. In later years, after his death, when stories about Alexander multiplied like rumors in a marketplace, many of them focused on the grand, the Gordian knot, the siege of Tyre, the march through the Hindu Kush, but some remembered the smaller things, that he woke early, that he ate simply, that he never asked for more than the bare minimum to start his day. One general recalled a morning outside Babylon when Alexander stood barefoot in the dust, eating a crust of barley bread while watching birds pick seeds from a broken wagon. He watched them for 10 minutes, said nothing, then handed the last of his bread to the youngest page and walked on. There was no speech, no lesson, but the gesture was remembered long after the speeches were forgotten, because there, in the silence of breakfast, was the essence of the man, not the god, not the conqueror, just the boy who had learned early that hunger is not a punishment, it's a practice. But can a man raised on such austerity ever allow himself peace, or does he wake every morning, even in victory, still chewing, as if the war hasn't ended? Asterisk. There are no songs about the night before, no epics carved into temple walls to describe how soldiers lay in the dark, wrapped in wool that smelled of sheep and mildew. Try not to think about the next day's blood, but it is there, in that silence, that war begins, before the charge, before the trumpet, before the orders barked through rising dust. It begins in the dark, on the ground, with men who cannot sleep. The army of Macedons, still raw, still untested, had made camp in a narrow valley on the edge of what is now remembered as northern Thessaly. The terrain was dry, but not desert. The dirt packed hard. Sparse shrubs offered no shade. The air smelled of sweat and dying grass. Alexander was not yet king. He was 17, acting as regent, while his father, Philip, pursued northern campaigns. This particular skirmish miner, by the standards of later history, was, at the time, everything. A nearby city-state had rebelled. Mercenaries had been hired. Tensions threatened to undo what Philip had just spent a decade building down. And now, young Alexander was about to command soldiers in battle for the first time. But not yet. Not until dawn. For now, it was only the night, and the thousand small discomforts that come with it. Most soldiers slept in pairs or trios, huddled for warmth, despite the season. The ground was uneven, rocks jabbing between shoulder blades and hips. Some had cloaks, others only worn tunics. The lucky ones laid reed mats or old wool between their bodies and the dirt. Few could sleep. They whispered, coughed, shifted. Some prayed quietly, with hands pressed to the soil, mouthing the names of gods they barely believed in. Others stared at the stars. In those moments, rank faded. Even veterans muttered to themselves, like boys, because fear does not respect experience, and no matter how many drills they'd done, how many times they'd practiced formations, the truth lingered in the silence. Tomorrow, some of them would die. There is no training that prepares a man to lie on his back and wonder whether the breath he just took might be among his last. The campfires were small and few. Flames were rationed as tightly as food. Smoke drew attention, and in this part of the country, attention could be fatal. So the night was dark, not poetically, so just practically. The kind of dark that makes shadows melt into each other. The kind of dark that feels cold, even when the air is warm. Alexander did not sleep either. He walked the perimeter, slowly, alone. He refused a cloak. He carried no torch. He paused every few minutes to look at the faces of the men on the ground. Not to speak, to see them. He walked not like a king, but like a man searching for something. And perhaps he was great, maybe, or clarity. Or perhaps he was simply afraid, and trying not to let it show. He passed by a soldier barely older than himself, muttering in a low voice something about his mother. The words were soft, not a prayer, to memory. Alexander kept walking. A veteran nearby sat upright, grinding his teeth. He had a chipped helmet balanced beside him like a sleeping dog. Rest, the soldier muttered when he saw Alexander. You'll need it. Alexander paused. Do you? The man shrugged. I've learned to live without it. Alexander didn't smile, but he nodded. He walked on. He stopped near the edge of camp, where the scouts rested, and looked toward the valley beyond. The hills were quiet. The enemy unseen, but close. A commander approached from behind. Quiet, but not silent enough. You should sleep, my lord. Alexander shook his head. Sleep belongs to those who can afford ignorance. The commander did not press the issue. Instead, they stood together for a while, saying nothing. The stillness wasn't peace. It was pressure, waiting, doubt, slowly turning into decision. Somewhere behind them, a man was retching. Too much bad wine, or too much fear. Another was whispering to a small wooden charm he wore around his neck. Someone coughed until it turned into a sob. None of it was unusual. This was the ritual before the ritual. The slow unraveling of calm before the storm of orders, of shields clashing and knees shaking beneath leather armor. And somewhere in that long night, Alexander finally sat. Not in a tent, but on the dirt, back straight, hands on his knees. He didn't close his eyes. Instead, he whispered to himself lines from the Iliad, perhaps, or from Aristotle, or maybe from nothing at all. Words to fill the silence, to keep the doubt from growing too loud. In there, in the dark, He became something else, not a child, not yet a king, just a boy surrounded by men, trying not to show that he was afraid of failing them, because tomorrow, when the sun rose, they would follow him, and he needed them to believe, even if he wasn't sure yet what he believed himself. But what kind of leader is shaped by a night without sleep? And what is it that men really fight for when the silence finally breaks? Somewhere around the third hour of the night, what the Greeks called tridonyx, the camp changed. Not all at once. There was no horn, no drumbeat, just the subtle shift of bodies preparing themselves for wakefulness. A cough that didn't fade back into silence. A boot laced slowly, then relaced. A pair of soldiers quietly sharpening blades with small, circular strokes. The wind was colder now, curling between shield stacks and rattling loose saddle straps. Somewhere nearby, a mule grunted. The sky above had begun to pale not with color, but with softness. The stars were no longer crisp, their edges blurred. Morning was close, but not yet. And in that sliver of time, the narrow hour between night and light, men became strangers to themselves. This was when doubts whispered loudest. For many of the soldiers, this would be their first time in formation under real threat. Training had been rigorous. The Macedonian phalanx required precision. Long sarissa spikes, twice the height of a man, had to move as one. If even a single rank faltered, the whole line could collapse, and collapse meant slaughter. Some men recited steps in their minds like a song. Left foot, plant, angle, brace, step, brace, press, step. Others thought about family, about the way their child breathed when asleep, about a brother who had died in a skirmish near the border, about nothing in particular, just the aching need to stay alive. Alexander had not slept. He had not even closed his eyes. He had remained seated at the edge of camp, watching the distant slope where the enemy waited. He held no sword, no helmet, only a dagger and a length of cloth, which he folded and refolded in his lap. He was not praying. He was preparing not for combat, but for presence, because he understood, even at 17, that a general's body must carry the illusion of certainty, the illusion that he knows what comes next. As the eastern hills flushed with the first suggestion of light, the camp stirred. The fires were rekindled small, fast, just enough to warm the hands and soften stale bread. No one ate with appetite. They chewed as if it were a task. Alexander stood, brushing the dirt from his cloak. He walked to the center of camp where the officers had begun to assemble. They waited. No one spoke first, not because of fear, but because of ritual. The general speaks first, even if he is not a king, even if he is a boy. Alexander looked at them, his eyes bleary, but still steady. "We fight together," said, voice low but deliberate, "because we are one, and one does not break." It was not a speech to stir the blood. It was something else, a sentence like a wedge meant to hold back fear, just long enough for discipline to take its place. The officers nodded. No cheer, no cry, just agreement. Orders were given in short phrases. Units split off to ready their positions. Scribes marked names, should they be needed later for rewards or for graves. Alexander mounted a horse, not for show, but for mobility. He moved from line to line, not issuing commands, but letting himself be seen. Visibility, his father had once said, keen is a kind of weapon. He paused near the front ranks, where the youngest soldiers stood. Some were barely older than him. One trembled, not noticeably, but Alexander saw it. The boy gripped his spear too tightly, Kay's knuckles white. Alexander said nothing. He dismounted, walked over Kay, and gently adjusted the boy's stance. "Relax your fingers," he said. "Tension wastes energy. I'm thee." Boy nodded, swallowed, breathed, and Alexander walked on. He stopped only once more before the battle began. A grove of trees marked the edge of the field. Okay. There, he stood alone for a moment, watching the light rise behind him and stretch toward the enemy ridge. He did not pray, but he remembered something Aristotle had told him. Control the moment between thought and action. That is where reason lives. He took a breath, and another, then turned. The phalanx had formed. Long shadows of spears pointed toward the morning. Helmets glinted like teeth in a snarling jaw. The enemy was not yet moving. But soon, the space between armies always feels larger than it is, and the silence is deeper until someone moves, until history begins. But even then, when metal sings and men shout, something remains beneath it all. The memory of the dirt from the night before. The dreams that didn't come. The weight of the bread still sitting in the gut. And the knowledge that the man beside you is trembling, might die before the sun reaches its peak. So what is it really that a soldier carries into battle? Not just weapons, but silence. The kind that gathers in the hours before dawn and shapes every step that comes after. Asterisk, the first sound was not a horn. It was a single, shouted order, sharp, clear, ancient. Something like, Ife, move. The Macedonian phalanx advanced slowly. Not a charge, not a rush, just methodical, deliberate steps. Each soldier moved as if part of a single body, spheres extended, feet stamped in rhythm, shields aligned. Alexander remained behind the forward lines. He watched the sun climb the ridgeline, its gold just beginning to show. He didn't speak, didn't twitch. His horse shifted beneath him, high pulled gently at the reins. It quieted from the opposing hill. Persian light infantry had begun to descend, slower, perhaps less organized, but with superior numbers. That day was not meant to be decisive, but the boy general knew. First impressions leave marks deeper than blades. This was his first command, and they would remember what happened here, or they would not live at all. The first collision sounded like dropped barrels, like dry wood cracking under sudden weight. The front lines met with brutal force. Spears snapped. Men shouted, not in rage, but in strain, pushing, bracing, dying. Alexander's strategy, borrowed from Philip's long campaigns, was not elegant, but it was effective. Hold the line, let the enemy break their own shape against you. And when they do send the left flank forward, then the cavalry cuts through the weak corner, clean, like slicing cured meat. But nothing about it was clean. The ground turned slick in places. The smell changed. Blood is not subtle, especially on sun-warmed grass. Mud formed not from rain, but from marrow and water leaking from the wounded. Alexander did not flinch. He watched the break form, watched the signal rise, then nodded once. The left surged. The horses came next, hooves pounding like war drums. His cavalry, not veterans, but bold, sharp, young, and he rode with them. He did not have to. No one expected it. But he knew what kind of myth he wanted to become. And myths do not sit at the edge of the field. He rode fast, the scarf around his neck unraveling behind him. The front shattered. Not all at once, it's just enough. And in that moment, the Persians flinched. The rest was muscle, repetition, the part of war that doesn't feel like thought. Men stabbed until their arms burned. They kicked and turned and bled through soaked tunics, and the dirt drank everything. Victory came not with fanfare, but with the quiet collapse of resistance. One by one, the Persian units faltered, then fled. The field was not quiet, but the worst of it had passed. Alexander did not chase. He reined in, looked around. He didn't shout. didn't raise a fist. He just breathed. Slowly, he had survived. His cloak was torn. One cut, near the hip, bled sluggishly. He ignored it. He walked through the field, dismounted, and saw his soldiers not as men in formation, but as bodies, some upright, some curled, already stiffening. The boy king, not yet crowned, knelt beside a dying soldier. He didn't speak, simply took the man's hand. The soldier whispered something. It might have been a name, or a question, Tia, or just a sound. Alexander stayed until the breath left, then stood. The army watched him not all at once, but with the slow awareness that the battle was over. He gathered them not with the trumpet, but by walking to the center of the field and standing there. Still, they formed around him, not quite in ranks, not quite disorganized, just human. He looked at them, bloodied, bruised, some weeping, some silent, and he said, "This is not glory. This is the price. You paid it. And history will not forget your names." It wasn't poetic. It didn't need to be, because in that moment, beneath the mountains, gaze, and the gulls circling high, every man there knew he wasn't just a general's son. He was their general now. They made no cheer, no chant. They just stood with him. It's a smell of death in their noses. It's a warmth of the morning sun on their cheeks. And that night, they laid again on the dirt, this time with fewer among them. They slept differently, not deeply, not peacefully, but with something like belief in the boy who stood still while the world cracked open in each other, in the strange, terrible, unspoken rhythm of survival. And what do survivors remember, really, when the dust settles? Not the number of enemy dead, not the names of ridges or streams. They remember the sound of the spear's first crack, the way the man beside them didn't run, the weight of the sky above them when it was finally, briefly, quiet. Asterisk, before she wore the crown, before she strapped the beard to her chin, before she defied thousands of years of ritual with the simplest word king. She was just another royal daughter playing near the columns of Karnak. Hatshepsut was not meant to rule, at least not in the way Egypt's rigid traditions dictated, born around 1507 BCE into the 18th dynasty, one of the most powerful and prosperous in Egyptian history. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and his principal wife, Emos. Her blood was pure, noble, God-touched by lineage. But still, she was a girl. Asterisk. In ancient Egypt, women could hold great power behind the throne. They could be regents. They could be royal wives, priestesses, landowners. But to be pharaoh, it's where the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. To be not just a steward of divine order, but the living embodiment of Horus. That path was sealed with ritual, wrapped in male forms, and guarded by priests who whispered in temple corridors and steered the state like a boat on the Nile. And yet, there was a Hatshepsut, watching, learning, waiting. Her childhood would have seemed lavish to modern eyes: marble floors, hand-ground cosmetics, musicians filling the courtyards of Thebes. But royal life was far from idle. She was trained, educated, schooled in law, administration, and the sacred rites of Amen, while other noble girls learned to manage estates and bear sons. Hatshepsut studied divine texts. She learned to read hieroglyphs not common, even among the elite, and absorbed the rituals of the priesthood like clay soaking water. She walked often through Karnak Temple, its halls cooled with shadow, its air thick with incense and old breath. There, the god Amen was said to reside, and there, the idea of her future began to take shape, not as queen, but as something else. Her father, Thutmose I, recognized her ambition. Some say he even spoke of it aloud, joking, or perhaps not, that she would have made a better heir than any son but tradition held. When Thutmose I died, the throne passed to Thutmose II, her half-brother, born of a lesser wife. To secure the transition, Hatshepsut was married to him. Not uncommon in royal circles, brother to sister, god blood to god-blood. She became great royal wife, but it was not love that bound them. It was protocol. Thutmose II's reign was short, perhaps weak. And when he died, he left behind a son Thutmose III born to a secondary wife, and still, just a child Egypt now faced a problem. A toddler cannot perform the said festival. A child cannot lead armies, consult oracles, or receive tribute from Nubian emissaries. Someone had to rule, okay? So Hatshepsut stepped forward, not as queen mother, for she was not the boy's birth mother, but as regent, caretaker of the throne, voice for the faltering divine order. At first, this was not unusual. Women had served as regents before, guiding young pharaohs through their minority. But what came next was different. Over the next few years, something shifted in temple carvings. Her titles began to change. Not Queen Regent, but His Majesty. Not wife of the god, but Horus, strong of arm. And then came the image that scandalized and immortalized her. Hatshepsut, wearing the royal kilt, bare-chested like a man, and with the ceremonial beard of kings. She had not transformed into a man. She had transformed the language of power to rule. She didn't just take the title, she redefined the ritual performance of it. There were murmurs. The priesthood grumbled. Some loyalists whispered of usurpation. But Hatshepsut's strategy was slow, careful, deliberate. She claimed divine birth, saying Amen himself had visited her mother's chamber in the guise of Thutmose I. She had murals carved, showing the god touching Amos's belly. She had herself depicted in male form, not to deceive, but to declare. The gods had chosen her, and in truth, the country needed her. Trade resumed, temples blossomed, stability returned to the two lands. Even the Nile seemed to rise a little higher. Hatshepsut's most famous monument, her mortuary temple at Deir el-Barrios, out of the cliffs like a stone hymn, quiet and overwhelming. Its colonnades sang of peace, not conquest. Its terraces were lined with images of her as both a woman and king. But how did it feel in the quiet moments, when the scribes had gone, when the sandals were pulled off, when she stood alone by the lotus pool? Was she proud or just exhausted? In choosing to reign, she had taken on not just the weight of government, but the expectations of divinity. She had chosen the mask and worn it well. But how long can anyone bear the weight of pretending to be what they must be just to be heard, just to survive? Perhaps lies in the slow erosion of her memory after her death. But that is for the next night. Asterisk, the temple did not shout. It did not tower like the pyramids or twist like the obelisks. It whispered. It hummed. It unfolded in layers like a papyrus scroll, etched in limestone and sunlight. This was how Hatshepsut wanted to be remembered. Deir el-Bahri, the northern monastery, as it would be called, centuries later, was her chosen afterlife, her reply to critics, her masterstroke, located on the west bank of the Nile, just opposite Thebes. This mortuary temple was not just a burial site, it was a statement of legitimacy, divinity, and permanence. And yet, it did not begin with her. Long before Hatshepsut, the site had been used by Middle Kingdom kings. Mentuhotep II built his own temple there 600 years earlier, but it was Hatshepsut who expanded the vision, who made the cliffs into a canvas, who carved her name again and again into the stone, as though repetition alone could defy forgetting. Her architect was a man named Senemat, a commoner by birth. He rose swiftly through the ranks thanks to talent, loyalty, and perhaps something more personal. Rumors swirled for centuries that they were lovers, that they shared not just politics, but but intimacy. No direct evidence confirms this, but the proximity of his tomb, the frequency of his image beside her, the care with which he carved her story into eternity, all suggests closeness. Perhaps devotion. Der El-Bari was built in terraces, 3 great levels of colonnades climbing into the cliffs like a staircase for the gods. Ramps connected each level. Gardens and myrrh trees, transplanted from the distant land of Punt, lined the paths. Even now, when the sun hits the stone just right, the temple seems to glow pale gold against the dark limestone of the Theban hills. But it was not just beauty. It was politics. Inside the walls told stories of divine birth, of sacred journeys, of expeditions that brought incense and panther skins and rare woods from Punt, proof that Hatshepsut was not merely ruling, but flourishing. Her reign, which lasted roughly 20 years, was unusually peaceful for the new kingdom. No great wars. It is ballades, it is tukwi, I you do get it. No collapsing grain stores. Instead, there were obelisks tall, elegant fingers pointing to the heavens raised at Karnak. There were trade routes reopened, temples restored, taxes flowing like the Nile at flood, and still she wore the beard. Still, she spoke in the masculine form when addressing the gods. Why? Because power was not just in ruling well. It was in being seen to rule correctly, and so she embraced every ritual, every linguistic twist, every symbol and performance that made the throne seem legitimate in the eyes of the priests, the scribes, and the people. There was a pragmatism to it, a quiet brilliance. She did not erase her identity as a woman, but she learned how to bend the rigid forms of kingship just enough to fit herself into them, not by confrontation, by construction. Yet behind the symmetry of her temples and the certainty of her inscriptions, the sands of resistance stirred. Some members of the court never accepted her. To them, she was an interloper, a regent who clung to the throne beyond her time, a woman who, despite divine claims, had no place among the living gods. But they could not challenge her openly. Not while trade boomed, not while grain was plentiful, not while the people still cheered the parades through. Thieves and Karnak. So they waited. Thutmose III, the boy she had once ruled on behalf of, grew into a man, a capable general, a patient prince. He trained, observed, and bided his time. Their relationship is one of history's quietest mysteries. There is no record of civil war between them. Cute, no inscriptions of betrayal or rebellion. Keet, Sid allowed him to rise within the military. He led campaigns, commanded respect. But the throne remained hers. Did they share power? Did he resent her? Did she fear him? The stone is silent, but what it does reveal is that, after her death, something changed. Bit by bit, her image was chiseled away. Her cartouches, sacred ovals that bore a pharaoh's name, were defaced. Her statues were smashed or buried. Her name was omitted from king lists. Not in a rush, not all at once, but methodically, deliberately, with the patience of erosion. This was not vengeance in heat. It was memory management. To the priests, the scribes, the keepers of order, Hatshepsut's legacy was dangerous. If she could be remembered as a successful female pharaoh, what doors might that open? What questions might that raise? Better to cover the murals, to chisel her profile from the temple walls, to reframe her buildings as the works of others, to leave her name adrift in obscurity. And for thousands of years, it worked. Her temple stood, but her identity faded. Tourists marveled at the structure, but misread the ruler. She was misunderstood, forgotten. It wasn't until the 19th century when scholars and archaeologists began piecing together broken statues and scattered texts that her story emerged again, discovered but defiant. Hatshepsut, pharaoh, king, builder of temples, bearer of the beard. But what does it mean to rule in disguise? To build in one's own name, only to see that name rubbed out like chalk? Is memory more fragile than limestone? Is power more fleeting than the Nile summer? Rise. We don't know what she thought in her final days. Whether she believed her temple would preserve her, whether she imagined the gods would protect her name. But even in erasure, she left behind more than her enemies intended. And there, in the shifting sands of Deir el-Bahri, her story waited. For centuries, till someone noticed a statue missing, its face, until someone saw the outline of a name, faintly, stubbornly, still visible beneath the chisel marks. At first, the damage was small. A nose chipped here, a cartouche scratched there. Statue, massive and proud, carefully toppled and buried in a pit of sand behind the temple she built herself. Not all destruction is loud. Sometimes it's careful, deliberate. It's carried out by people who understand how fragile memory really is. After Hatshepsut's death, her name began to vanish. It was not erased in flames. It was not shouted down. It was ... revised. Thutmose III, the young boy she had once ruled on behalf of, had matured into one of the most militarily successful pharaohs in Egyptian history. He led campaigns deep into Qenon, Syria, and Nubia. His victories stretched Egypt's borders farther than ever before. He was, by all accounts, brilliant, patient, and perhaps quietly resentful. But what did he resent? Oh, that his stepmother had ruled instead of him. That she had worn the double crown and taken the royal title while he served as a general. Maybe, but the political situation had changed. Hatshepsut was no longer alive to challenge him. There was no need to arrest, exile, or denounce her instead. Thutmose III waged a different kind of campaign. A war of memory. A slow, quiet conquest of her legacy. Her statues were removed from temples. Some were smashed. Others were hidden in pits and under foundations, most as if the destruction was meant to be reversible. As if someone, perhaps, even Thutmose himself, wasn't sure whether she deserved to be forgotten or remembered later on his terms. The inscriptions bearing her name were recarved, her titles replaced. Scenes depicting her as pharaoh were subtly altered to depict her father, Thutmose I, or her co-ruler, Thutmose III himself. In some cases, her figure was completely removed, leaving ghostly blank spaces on the walls. And yet, this erasure was not universal. Not every temple was defaced. Not every reference was removed. At Karnak, some of her grand obelisks were left standing. They were too tall, too well built. One of them still stands today, the tallest surviving ancient obelisk in the world. Even in destruction, her monuments were stubborn. There was no formal decree to damn her name. No national purge, just silence. An awkward redaction by a culture that had no mechanism for understanding what she had done. Egyptian ideology made no room for women as kings, as regents. Yes, as queens and goddesses and wives and mothers, absolutely, but not pharaohs. And Hatshepsut had dared to carve herself into the king's role. Not temporarily, not symbolically, okay? She was the pharaoh. That truth remained too strange, too difficult to preserve in the brittle machinery of dynastic history. So she was removed. For nearly 3,000 years, her name disappeared from most king lists. Tourists and priests alike passed by her temple at Deir el-Bahari, wondering who had built it, never quite guessing the truth. It was only in the 19th century, with the rise of archaeology and Egyptology, that her name began to return. At first, it was confused. Early explorers thought her monuments belonged to Thutmose. 3. Others believed the statues with feminine features and male regalia were of a male pharaoh with unusually soft features, but as more inscriptions were uncovered, some missed by the ancient defacers, her story began to reassemble itself. There she was, carved between gods. There she was, sailing to the land of Punt. There she was, crowned by Amun himself, bearing both the ankh and the crook of kingship. And most powerfully, there she was, speaking her own names aloud in stone. Makher truth is the soul of the sun god, Keet. Sun god, Hatshepsut, suit foremost of noble ladies. It was not until the 20th century that she received full scholarly recognition, that historians pieced together her reign, that they saw the evidence for a peaceful, prosperous Egypt, led by a woman who refused to stand behind a man. And so she emerged, quietly, as always, not in triumph, but in persistence, not through propaganda, but through archaeology. Through the fragments the ancients failed to destroy. And what did we find? A pharaoh who built magnificent temples, who restored trade routes, who ordered the first recorded expedition to the fabled land of Puntan expedition, so successful that her temple still depicts myrrh trees being dug up and carried back to Egypt. Ruler who stabilized an empire, who refused to define her reign by war, who reigned not because she claimed it, but because she held it. And perhaps that's the lesson. Hatshepsut did not conquer through force. She endured through stone, through architecture, through the sheer fact of having done the job of king, regardless of whether her name remained on the wall. She reminds us that history does not belong to the loudest, that survival isn't always about fame or conquest, that sometimes quiet governance outlasts loud ambition. She ruled in a way that most pharaohs, male or female, managed without military glory, without bloodshed, without crisis. And though she was forgotten, though her name was chiseled out and her face smashed in, she was never truly gone, because the sandstone remembers, the obelisks remember, the myrrh trees planted along her temple's courtyards remember, and now, so do we. But why was that so frightening? Why did her memory feel like a threat? Is it because a single woman proved that the system could be bent, that the rituals of power could be redefined? Or is it because, somewhere deep in the temple walls, the stone still murmurs her story uninvited, unforgotten, and entirely unerasable? Asterisk, the library was cold. Even in summer, the thick stone walls of the abbey held the chill. Each morning, before the sun cleared the mist from the hills, Brother Oldebert lit a stub of candle and settled at his wooden desk. The flame flickered gently, casting long, quivering shadows across rows of vellum and jars of ink. He was not young anymore. His fingers ached in the mornings. The bones in his wrist popped when he dipped his quill. But he still copied, carefully, obediently, and not just scripture. Not anymore. The abbey had once been proud of its scriptorium, its room for the copying of holy texts. Generations of monks had passed down their quiet artistry, illuminating margins with vines and beasts, preserving the words of saints and popes in delicate calligraphy. But now, something had changed. There were rules, strict ones, by which books could be copied. In the year 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council had drawn hard lines, doctrinal boundaries, theological red tape. Certain texts particularly older philosophical works or early church heresies, were to be sealed, not shared, destroyed, not duplicated. But Brother Odalbert could not stop himself. He knew the risks. He had read the decrees. He had watched a fellow monk publicly scourged for making a second copy of an ancient Greek tract on astronomy. The church had its reasons. Unapproved knowledge was dangerous. Ideas could mislead. And yet, books remained hidden, forgotten, buried in the older corners of monastic collections. Some had survived the burnings of earlier centuries. Others had been misfound marked as commentaries on scripture, but secretly containing older pagan thought. Adalbert did not seek these out, at least not at first. But one evening, in the flickering light of a dying fire, he pulled a scroll from behind a pile of psalters and found something that unsettled him. A line of Latin, not sacred, not familiar, rendered in the careful hand of a monk long dead. Let none enter here who do not understand geometry. Key. It was a translation of a Greek text, Euclid, mathematics from the ancient world, and it was elegant, pure, completely removed from doctrine, and yet somehow divine in its symmetry. He read through the night, not because it was useful, not because he had permission, but because it existed, and someone, centuries ago, had cared enough to write it down in the cold, with ink, by hand. So Odalbert began his quiet rebellion. He did not shout. He did not preach. He simply copied. By day, he worked on the Gospels and the letters of Paul. By night, he returned to Euclid, then Ptolemy, then commentaries on Aristotle from Syriac monks long dead. The ink changed. He used his duller nibs for the forbidden texts, smaller letters, K margins. He kept his breath shallow, his footsteps light. No one must hear him leaf through pages not approved by the abbot. He did not speak of it to the younger monks. They were too fearful, too obedient, but sometimes they noticed the ink on his cuffs, smudges on the side of his fingers, at Compline, the way his candle burned later than the others. Brother Odalbert, one of them, whispered once, "Do you rest at all?" He only smiled. Rest was for those who had nothing left to preserve. In his private alcove, behind a shelf of liturgical chants, he began storing his copies, wrapped in linen, tucked behind false bindings. He was not the only one in the wider world. Others were doing the same, quiet men and women who refused to let knowledge die. In Andalusia, Jewish scribes translated Arabic treatises on medicine and philosophy. In Sicily, Christian scholars worked side by side with Muslims to preserve ancient Greek logic. In Baghdad and Constantinople, older libraries still smoldered with the embers of Alexandra's long-lost knowledge. But here, in this isolated stone monastery on the edge of the Holy Roman Empire, Odalbert worked alone. He did not know if the books he copied would ever be read. He did not know if they would survive fire, war, or the damp rot of centuries. But he knew the weight of their silence. Each idea copied was a defiance of entropy. Each diagram inked was a refusal to forget. He thought of the scribes of Odove, Cassiodorus, Isidore, witness men who had tried to bridge the fall of Rome with the rise of faith. He thought of the anonymous monks who had preserved texts through Viking raids, through famine, through plague. He did not need his name remembered, only the words. And yet, the candle stub still sat in his cell, unused, but waiting. Was the knowledge he preserved lost? Had his efforts meant nothing? Or had some young monk, in the briefest moment before the texts were cleared away, opened a page and read a line, a single sentence, a thought, a shape traced by ink and geometry and quiet resistance? Asterisk, the garden did not suit him. Brother Odalbert's knees ached on the uneven stone paths, and his back strained each time he bent to trim the wild fennel. The other monks, some of whom had joined the order, after he had already grown old, assumed he He had simply aged out of usefulness, but they didn't know. They hadn't seen the quiet confiscation, a respectful exile. He was still permitted to worship, still permitted to sing, but he no longer held ink, no longer touched vellum, no longer copied, at least, not officially. In truth, Odelbert had already prepared for this. He'd seen it coming gradually, in subtle signs. The abbot had become more careful with visitors. The scriptorium doors had begun to creak a little less open than before. In the chapter house, there were whispers of heretical texts being discovered and other monasteries' monks removed, sometimes imprisoned. Some had even been handed to the Inquisition. Adalbert, though silent, had made peace with what was coming, and he had buried his work accordingly behind a loose flagstone in the south transept, tucked beneath a wooden cross where no one ever knelt. He had sealed the chest. It held not the originals, they were too precious, too incriminating, but copies, his own transcriptions, Ptolemy's model of planetary spheres, K. Translation of Galen on fevers, K. Fragments from Plotinus, diagrams from Archimedes, and a treatise from an anonymous Coptic monk, written in Greek. Pondering the soul as a thing that vibrates, Adalbert had copied that one twice. Not because he understood it, he didn't fully, but because the metaphor moved him. Even now, when he knelt among the herb beds, he sometimes whispered the lines to himself as he plucked thyme or mulched soil. The soul, like sound, is made of pulse and breath, the pine for the ear to catch, but real. He wondered what the other monks thought of him. They rarely asked questions, and when they did, he replied with a smile and a shrug. He had learned that the less he said, the more they assumed he was harmless. But there was one, a novice named Linhart, who seemed more curious than the others. Barely 20, bright, and, unlike the others, fond of questions that wandered. "Brother," Linhart asked one morning as they pruned at the fig trees, "is it true that before the flood, people lived for hundreds of years?" Odelbert wiped his hands on his robe and looked up. "Some say so, but do you believe it?" A pause. "I believe that stories are how we remember what facts forget." Linhart frowned, but didn't press start later that day. The novice passed Odelbert a folded page, crumpled and smudged. On it, in rough script, were 3 Greek words, misspelled, but earnest. He was trying to understand, trying to learn. Adalbert didn't encourage him, didn't respond. But the next morning, before sunrise, Linhart found a slip of paper on his cot, corrected spelling, a diagram of a circle, a few short lines in Latin explaining Plato's ideal form. Nothing dramatic, but it was enough. They began a silent exchange, notes left under stones, diagrams scratched into wax tablets and quickly erased. Odelbert never spoke of what he had copied, but he began sharing pieces, disconnected lines, safe enough to pass as philosophy. Hints, not manifestos. Linhart, in return, offered questions. Could the stars be predictable? Did early Christians disagree with each other? Was it wrong to be curious? Odelbert never answered directly. He knew too well that answers were dangerous. But he planted seeds. In the spring of that year, a fire broke out in a neighboring abbey. Rumors came with the smoke. Texts had been found in the cellar copies of Origen and early Greek commentaries. The abbot there was sent to Rome for questioning. In Odelbert's own monastery, the tone shifted. Silences became longer, eyes more cautious. The abbot ordered a full inventory of the library. All unauthorized texts were to be removed and destroyed. This was not unusual. It happened before, but Odelbert saw the writing on the wall, or rather, the absence of it when he crept to the scriptorium. Late one night, he found the door barred. Not locked, but blocked symbolically and physically. A single candle sat inside on the desk, burned to its base. No wax catcher. Message. This space is no longer sacred. He did not return. Instead, he wrote from memory. In the back of his garden tool shed, he kept scraps of birch bark. He inked them with soot and oil in the thin tips of dried fennel stalks. The work was crude, cruder than anything he'd done before. But it kept his mind sharp. He wrote diagrams in the dirt, then erased them before anyone passed. He recited axioms of Euclid as he pruned grapevines. Sometimes, when he trimmed basil, he whispered lines of Marcus Aurelius. Remembering the strange comfort in ancient stoicism, you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do, say, and think. A comforting thought for bedtime, perhaps. But to Odilbert, it was freedom, and so the garden became his new scriptorium. The monks saw a tired old man tending herbs, but below the surface, hidden behind mulch and compost, thoughts still bloomed. One morning, Linhart left a sealed pouch under a stone near the fig tree. Inside, a folded page, neat handwriting, a translation of a Hebrew passage. Something about the Book of Enoch, a book not in the canon, a book not meant to be copied. Adalbert stared at it for a long time, his breath shallow, his heart heavy. He knew what this meant. Linhart had found the hidden texts, or worse, had found someone else still copying. It was no longer a quiet secret between a retired monk and a curious novice. Now, it had grown. There was risk. There was momentum, and Odilbert, for the first time in decades, wasn't sure what to do next. Should he warn the boy? Hide the texts again? Confess everything and protect others? Or had the time for silence passed? Asterisk. The wind at night carried stories in its silence. Brother Odilbert often sat in the tool shed, long after the others had returned to their cells, listening to the faint rustle of the monastery's fig trees. He imagined them whispering the names of lost authors, Heraclitus, Sappho, Democritus, each a leaf trembling in the dark, each a memory just shy of being forgotten. The pouch Linhart had left beneath the stone, with its copied fragment of the Book of Enoch, had changed everything. Odilbert had not responded, not even with one of his cryptic notes. Days passed. Linhart said nothing, but Odilbert saw it in the boy's eyes. Expectation, disappointment, and beneath it, still curiosity. One late afternoon, as the sun bowed low and spilled a warm saffron glow across the cloister, Odilbert found Linhart alone in the vegetable garden, inspecting the peas. He walked slowly toward the novice and offered a single sentence, quietly. Come to the tool shed after Compline. No more was said. No words during vespers. No glances exchanged. That night, in the dim glow of an oil lamp that gave off more scent than light, Odilbert opened the floorboards. Beneath him, in a wax-sealed bundle wrapped in sheep's wool and linen, he retrieved a set of birch bark folios, a few tightly rolled slips of inked goat parchment, and one heavy wax tablet bearing the faint indentation of Euclid's first proposition. He said nothing as Linhart watched. Instead, he handed the boy a folio one he had copied from a long-lost text attributed to an early Syriac Christian who believed mathematics was the language of God. It described ratios as divine harmonies, angles as gifts of logic and geometry, as proof that the world has order, even if men do not. Linhart read in silence. Then he looked up. Why did you keep all this? Odilbert sat down, slowly, onto a wooden crate. Because forgetting is the most dangerous kind of obedience. The next few nights were filled with whispers, diagrams, translations, and warnings. Odilbert explained how certain texts had been banned not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. Not all, of course. Some were nonsense, dangerous, or broken fragments of speculation. but others, they were simply other works of astronomy that did not mention Genesis, natural philosophy that questioned the flood, writings from Arab polymaths who had translated Greek logic into terms more precise than Latin could handle. Linhart was drawn to it all, like ivy toward stone, and yet Odilbert knew it could not last. Whispers had already begun to echo in the stone hallways. One of the older monks, Brother Kuno, had seen Linhart entering the tool shed at dusk. Another had asked why Odilbert no longer spent his days in the library. Questions were coming, and then, one morning, they arrived. The abbot stood at the head of the refectory after breakfast and announced that an inspection was to be conducted not only of the scriptorium and library, but of individual monks' cells and any auxiliary structures. A routine matter, he said, with a neutral smile. Everyone knew it. WASN, single quotes, TADAL, me, in, Linhart, met in the herb garden, not speaking. It was too late for escape. Too early for confession. But something in Linhart had changed. He stood straighter. His voice didn't shake. I'll take the fall, he said simply. You're old. They'll be kinder. Odilbert shook his head. No, you still have decades to endure. I'm already mostly gone. But the boy did not argue. That evening, just before the inspection began, Linhart approached the abbot. He said, only this, there's something I need to confess. They took him gently at first. It was a novice, naive, easily forgiven. But then the texts were found. Not in the tool shed. Not beneath the fig tree. Not even in Odilbert's garden.